Hey, so I'm late to the party. Viltrox released their 35mm f1.2 lens, and I'm sure you've seen every other video. But in an effort to go against the grain and because I don't want to get washed down the SEO, I decided to do my video one day later. I've actually had this lens for quite a long time. I've been able to test it out, go through some of the firmware updates, go through some of the features, but I want to make it in reference to professional work that I would actually do. Of course, we're going to focus on some of the specs if you haven't seen some of the other videos already, but at the same time, I want to put it into the context of the specs that I care about, stuff I like, and also one or two of the jobs that I brought it on. But well, we'll get there. Now, as far as disclosures go, if you're wondering, hey, Kofi, are you saying nice things about this lens because you're paid and sponsored to by Viltrox? Yes, I am. They did pay me to actually create this showcase of a video. So at the very least, I could call it more of an overview and not necessarily a review. Take that which you will. I am getting paid to actually make this video. I get to keep this lens as well. And I don't necessarily think Viltrox has an impact on this video because I didn't send them a draft before I actually posted this. So hopefully they're okay with that. But let's get into the rest of the video. The Viltrox 35mm f1.2 is definitely not a small lens. It features a 77mm filter thread, which is great, especially when you want to put on things like ND filters, which I use for the majority of this video. It also features two custom buttons that you could actually go into your phone and customize as well as your camera, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. You have an AF and MF manual switch, and as well as a clickable aperture. You'll also notice right around the lens mount you have a USB-C port, which is going to come in handy a little bit later, and as well as you have the screen. Not only can you tell your focusing distance and your aperture, but also you can customize a couple settings on here as well. Okay, now it's test footage time. We decided to go book out a studio in Toronto, set up a bunch of lights, get a model, and get some test shots to find out what the 35mm lens can do. Now, the reason why I say we is because I actually brought on another guest on this channel. Prince Mason is someone who moved in from Nigeria to Toronto, and we actually haven't collaborated on a video, but despite the fact that I could finally read my Instagram DMs, I could finally get this video done. I could collaborate with someone that's not only from the motherland, but also at the same time, an incredibly talented photographer as well. He also might give us our word of the day.
Okay, so Uncle Kofi is here to give you the Ghanaian language of the day. But today we have a special guest. We have Wofa Prince. And Wofa Prince is going to tell you the true word of the day.
I'm Nigerian.
Oh, okay, so we have to change up. So maybe you will teach me a Nigerian word. Maybe just not your jollof.
That's me, bro. Like, why you bringing jollof up?
I just want to make sure that we are keeping things proper here.
You know, hold on. So, if you're trying to tell somebody to come here, in my language, you say Kazi. It's Akoko Edo from Ibilo, so you say Kazi. But at the same time, you can just do Yoruba one, you can say Wa.
So,
Wambi.
So in Ghana, we say bra. So if I want someone to come, we say bra. So sometimes when they have your plate of jollof, I'll say, hey, Kwame, bra.
Because our jollof is better.
No, rid yourself from the poison. You have to rid yourself from the poison. Back to the video.
Now, as far as this lens go, I never really needed to have macro capabilities, but the minimum focusing distance is going to be 0.34 meters or just over about a foot. Now, this Viltrox 35mm is exceptionally sharp and it's very clean, and also it doesn't flare that much. Now, obviously you might want to use a little bit of a different flashlight, but I forgot mine at home, so using my iPhone light is going to be just fine. However, when I put the light source as close to the lens as possible and I move it around the frame, what you're going to notice is you might get a little bit of an outside ring at the end, but overall, putting a light source very close to the glass doesn't necessarily wash out your entire frame. Now, that might be a case of just having bigger glass or just having better glass, but at the same time, if you're someone who has light sources that go directly to your lens while shooting, you don't have a flare that washes out the entire frame. Now, not being a native Sony lens, it doesn't actually have the focus breathing compensation that's on a lot of Sony mirrorless cameras. Now, with that, I tested the focus breathing while just rotating the focus from near to far, and there is a little bit of breathing in here, and I will add that it actually was a little bit worse when I first got this lens. However, when we talk about the app a little bit later in this video, some of the firmware updates actually help correct for a couple of imperfections in the optics. However, if you don't have focus breathing compensation in here, it's not a native Sony lens, so you will see it a little bit. And again, shooting it wide open is a bit more pronounced. And if you were to stop down a little bit, which I kind of didn't do in this example, it might not be as pronounced. However, when you're making big racks and focus, you are going to notice a little bit of that lens breathing. Now, this is my kind of janky, kind of not autofocusing test. Now, there's probably better autofocusing tests, and you're probably going to see a bunch of them because it's embargo day. However, However, when the subject is moving across and back and forth through frame, and I just kind of recorded a screen on my phone, you notice that the autofocusing box actually stays pretty sticky on your subject. Even as our model walks in and out of frame, turns around, walks away, comes back, ducks down, does all the other stuff that you do in autofocusing tests, things are pretty solid. Now, I have used on the a7C II, and a lot of this video and this portion is on the a7C II, but I've also used this on the Sony FX6, which has autofocus as well. I did use the autofocus on the Sony FX6. I didn't necessarily shoot wide open on that shoot, but I did in this example, and things held up pretty well. Now, I don't really have a lot of commentary in terms of the color and the sharpness out of this lens. For the most part, things were a little bit monochromatic. We were in a warmer studio, and we're working with similar tones all over the room. However, I can say that if you are watching all these shots, they're shot directly wide open at 1.2. I'm not going to go over the minutia of chromatic aberration or other tiny little things or distortion or anything like that, because generally speaking, I didn't notice enough to care. But also, this lens is no slouch in the photography department as well. These are actually a bunch of photos that Prince actually shot. And if you are looking for a portrait or environmental portrait lens, or just a really good 35mm lens, I think it would be a gigantic understatement to say that this one is more than fine, because it was really good for what we were using it for. The fun thing about the 35mm f1.2 is that it also has built-in Bluetooth. That means you can connect to an app on your iOS device in order for you to do different things like customize the function buttons that are on your lens. Now, because I've had an earlier version of this, I've had this for a few months now, one of the issues I ran into was a couple of things with autofocusing, and when I turned my camera off, sometimes the aperture would reset all the way to 1.2. Fixing this was as easy as connecting my phone to the lens and just updating my firmware, which is nice, and it gives reassurance because if there's any sort of quirks that may happen on your lens somewhere down the line, they could always update that with firmware, versus some other lenses that don't have the ability to do this, which becomes a little bit more difficult. So one of the questions you guys might have is, does this hold up in a professional environment? And I actually got to take this on my regular scheduled gym client gigs. This is just before NAB, where everyone else got to see the lens, and Viltrox kind of told on themselves and told them they're announcing this guy. But overall, the autofocus was pretty solid. I had to use manual focus just a couple of times, and that was because I was using the older firmware. So that's one of those things you take with a grain of salt, because having these things pre-production, sometimes you work out those kinks before the video is uploaded, where, we're here now. I also want to mention that I did use a Sony FX6 for this gig, so that way I could take down my ND filter to get my proper exposure while still shooting wide open and also still getting pretty solid autofocus. Now, overall, you might be thinking about the competition for this lens. There isn't a lot of 35mm E-mount 1.2 lenses with decent autofocus. The only other things I could compare this to is going to be the 35mm G Master lens, which I talked about like 3 years ago, and I still think that's one of my favorite lenses, except there's a couple of caveats. There's also going to be a Sigma variant of this guy in an f1.2 that also offers L-mount, which I kind of wish that Viltrox gets eventually, but the Sigma version is going to be a lot more expensive. Now, from the videos that I've seen, you've probably seen them as well because this is coming out after embargo, they don't necessarily look $500 or $400 on the G Master side better than having the Viltrox lens. Which means if you're okay with the size of this lens, which might be a point of contention for some, you're gonna save a lot of money. Now, speaking of the size of this lens, I have gigantic hands, so it doesn't bother me too much. And at the same time, using on the Sony a7C II, even though that package looks kind of funny with all the size considered, still balances on the RS4 Mini, which I actually used in this video. Now, $1,000 is still kind of a heavy price tag objectively, but compared to other lenses in this category, it's a lot cheaper than what you might be able to find. While at the same time still maintaining a lot of the quality that you would have from some of the more expensive guys, you just might have to get bigger hands or might just have to go to the gym to balance out your rig. Now, there are a couple things you want to be aware of. Like we mentioned before, there isn't going to be focus breathing compensation on this particular lens, so you are going to see some of that breathing. However, if you turn off the focus breathing compensation on 35mm to get the full width, and the other thing is just gonna be the size of this lens. This thing is a chonker, which means you're gonna have to have really big hands, a really big rig to balance it out, or overall, you're just gonna have to deal with a funny looking setup or just using both hands while you're shooting. That being said, outside of that, I don't necessarily have too many problems with this thing. I think it's really cool that it has a top screen, customizable buttons that you can get through a phone app, and overall, the look on it is really good. And if you haven't noticed, I've been shooting pretty much everything in this video on this 35mm lens, and actually wide open for the most part. A special shout out to Viltrox for actually sponsoring this video, helping me make this overview. And if you guys do want to support myself or this channel, you can check it out in the link in the description down below. And there's a little bit of a discount code. And even though it's only 5%, it still makes it cheaper than pretty much every other offering. The way I'm going to close out this video is you got to tell me what your favorite focal length is. And that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one.